substitute.
Delegate from Loudoun, Delegate LaRock.
Mr. Speaker, I move the committee substitute.
Shall the committee substitute be agreed to? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Substitute's agreed to. The delegate from Loudoun.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill substitute has the same three elements as the original bill. One, it provides for parental notification if a minor child communicates to an individual employed by their school they are considering or have decided to transition their gender at school. Number two, the bill provides for parental consent for any measures taken by the school to support the minor child, including counseling. And three, the bill clarifies that raising a child according to his or her biological sex may not be construed as child abuse or abuse. Mr. Speaker, I move the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading.
The delegate from Prince William, Delegate Rome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the delegate yield for a question?
Will the delegate yield?
I will.
The delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I read the bill, the first thing I would ask the delegate here is, once again, we see the phrase biological sex, and as it is undefined in the Code of Virginia. So the first question to the delegate, Mr. Speaker, would be, how does the delegate, in this case, define biological sex, and how is the principal or principal's designee, as mentioned in this, supposed to determine gender incongruence, as the phrase they would use, but what we would say is sex assigned at birth, as being a problem or being different than the, quote, biological sex, end of quote?
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to be trivial about this, but it brings to mind the interview of a Supreme Court justice. I am not a biologist, but I do know that it is very obvious in the school context that counselors would know a child's biological sex, having a child that has been present in the school, perhaps participated in different sports, and who would then confide in a counselor. Again, the bill talks about a situation where the child would present to a counselor that they, in their own mind, had decided to change their gender. So the student themselves would be likely to disclose as part of that decision in the conversation leading up to it what their actual biological sex is.
Mr. Speaker, will the delegate yield for a follow-up question?
Will the delegate yield? The delegate yields.
Mr. Speaker, as I read the bill where it says expresses to any individual who is employed in such school that such minor is experiencing gender incongruence, in this case, Mr. Speaker, would the delegate say that a student who chooses to talk to a counselor, who chooses to talk to a staffer, who chooses to talk to an adult at the school is putting themselves in harm's way by coming out in the first place to a trusted adult if they do not feel safe at home? And if that information were to get home, it could cause an adverse reaction.
Is there a question in that?
Yes.
Perhaps you could phrase the question part of it.
Mr. Speaker,
The delegate will restate the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would ask the delegate that if a student is, quote, expressing to any individual who is employed in such school that such minor is experiencing gender incongruence, on what limitations would there be for that student to do so? Because it says expresses. So, for example, if a student said, wow, I really think that life would be easier if I could just live as a girl every day. Life would be easier if I could just live as myself every day. And if that information got back home, and that child thinks that there is a reason that they would be unsafe for that, does the child, in this case, have their rights protected? And is that student going to be forcibly outed at home?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would say to the delegate, the situation that the delegate describes varies kind of wildly. A child saying, it might be easier to live as a girl is a long way from going to a counselor and saying, I am ready to transition. I'd like the school to participate in that transition. But if it were clear to the counselor, there are many, many other considerations that should take precedence over a child's feelings that maybe their parent wouldn't like that decision. An unemancipated child does not have rights to make medical decisions. The decision in this case basically amounts to a treatment decision of a medical health condition, and certainly one that a child a minor student, a minor child, does not have the authority to make. It's also not in the best interest of a child to make a decision that could have life-altering consequences, irreversible in many cases. And so, yes, I think it's distinctly in the best interest of a child to involve the parents. These are the parents, people that love the child, who care the most about the child, and are in a position to participate in this decision. And notice I didn't say reject or affirm. This bill doesn't take a position on whether or not that child is making the right decision, but it does seek to put the parent in the conversation instead of excluding them. Mr. Speaker, the hour is late, but I did share a brief with every member of the House. I meant to do it Friday. It didn't go out until this afternoon. But this is a brief that was filed in the Fourth Circuit right across the street, and it is in the name of a prominent expert in the area of transgender health and medicine, Dr. Erica Anderson. And Dr. Erica Anderson is a transgender female. And in this brief, you will find one right after the other, agreement with the premise of this bill. Children should not be treated, affirmed, without being evaluated, and there being a serious approach taken to dealing with that child's mental condition. And so I'd be glad to track through it if the delegate would like. I doubt that the body is interested in hearing from me on each of these. But this is not my opinion. This is the overwhelming body of evidence supported by clinical studies, one right after the other. Not to say that others may not disagree with that, but it's certainly a very supportable position that is not tied to an ideology. There is intellectual integrity in this. It says it is not in the best interest of a child to hurry them into affirmation. And for that reason, I hope the body will support the measure.
Mr. Speaker, will the delegate yield for one final question?
Will the delegate
One
yield?
final question, I will, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the delegate's words in this were in fact entirely correct, would the delegate agree that 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ and that the number one reason for that is family rejection?
Mr. Speaker, I can't speak to the data that the delegate brings forward, but we have been in contact with someone from social services who presumably has direct experience with this. And the question that we pose to them is, do you have any reported cases? And I'm not sure if this was a local or a statewide answer, but it was no, there had not been any reported cases where the reason stated for a child leaving their home was that that child made a decision to change their gender.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the delegate would like examples of students, of children who have been forced out of their homes, who have, after they were outed themselves, go right down the street and go to Side by Side. Go to Virginia Beach and go talk to one of the youth homeless centers over there and talk to those kids about what's happened. If you want experiences, you want to hear lived experiences from the very kids who this bill would affect, go talk to the kids who were kicked out of their homes and who were beaten for being outed against their own will. May I also remind the delegate that, as the delegate mentions one amicus brief, which very politely was shoved underneath my door yesterday, so thank you for that. What I would also say with this is that we have existing precedent within federal court as well. I would point to Sterling versus Borough of Minersville, in this case from 2000, in which they actually stated in this case that someone's sexual orientation, in that case, happens to be protected information, that you don't get to just forcibly out that just because someone is young. And it is not a stone's throw to think that the same goes for a gender identity, which can be an even more toxic situation. And Mr. Speaker, I would remind you, and I would remind the delegates across the aisle here, that when you had a 66-34 majority in 2017, HB 1612 from my predecessor had the same concept of forcibly outing students who were transgender. And what happened? Your own party killed that bill. Your own party killed that bill in subcommittee. And what happened later that fall? The people of Haymarket, Gainesville, Manassas Park fired that delegate and replaced him with the first out-and-seated trans-state legislator in the country because they were tired of dealing with stuff like this. They were tired of having to hear kids being used as political props and thrown to the wolves, where in a case like this, there is nothing in this bill, not a single thing in this bill that actually says, well, maybe we're going to take discretion. Maybe in this, we're going to say that in one kid's case, it could be unsafe. Maybe in one kid's case, it could get them hurt. Maybe one kid's case, it's going to create an environment that's not going to be welcoming for them, and that leads to suicide, that leads to homicide, that leads to beatings, that leads to homelessness. And when the delegate presented this in committee and made the entire case about human trafficking, number one, the bill doesn't even say the words human trafficking in it whatsoever, but we have voted today on engrossment for bills that actually deal with human trafficking. But what I would also tell you with this, Mr. Speaker, is that when we are dealing with that case, what happens to homeless youth? Homeless youth are exponentially more likely to be victims of human trafficking, to be prostituted. We are dealing with dire consequences on a bill as reckless as this. Forcibly outing kids, regardless of the safety of their home, regardless of what's going to happen to them when they get home. You can say you think that every single parent is going to love that child, and I wish to God that was true. But if that was true, Child Protective Services wouldn't exist in the first place. Mr. Speaker, this is my sixth and final session here. And when I got here in 2018, I thought we were done with all these anti-trans bills. I thought we were finished with this, and we were going to get on to the business of the Commonwealth. And what have we seen today? When the other side of the aisle has brought forward legislation dealing with anti-Semitism, and our members, Jewish members, actually presented their ideas that were rejected. When members wanted to legislate about the AAPI community, and our AAPI members had an idea for how to make it better, how to make it more inclusive, and those ideas were rejected. And now you're dealing with forcibly outing trans kids, and you didn't even talk to the one person in this body who actually knows what it's like to be scared to death as a 13, 14-year-old kid of anyone finding out that you're actually trans. You have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea the harm you're causing. These kids are watching this right now all across the Commonwealth. Do better for them.
The delegate from Loudoun, Delegate LaRock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly share the passion that the delegate from Prince William has for protecting children, and that's exactly why this bill is necessary. So moving away from some of the emotion, I'm going to go to some of the things that I reference in this amicus brief. Very briefly, Mr. Speaker. The World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH, which takes a decidedly pro-transitioning stance, has acknowledged that social transition in early childhood are controversial, that health professionals have divergent views, that families vary in the extent to which they allow their young children to make a social transition to another gender role, and that there is insufficient evidence to predict the long-term outcomes of completing a gender role transition during early childhood. WPATH, encourages health professionals to defer to parents as they work through the options and implications, even if parents do not allow a young child to make a gender role transition. Mr. Speaker, the American Psychological Association, for example, recommends a comprehensive evaluation and consultation with the parents of youth to discuss, among other things, the advantages and disadvantages of social transition during childhood and adolescence. The Endocrine Society likewise recommends a complete psychodiagnosis assessment. WPATH 2 recommends a comprehensive psychodiagnostic and psychiatric assessment covering areas of emotional function, peer and other social relationships, and intellectual function / school achievement. Mr. Speaker, I could go on, but I won't. But this is what I'm trying to point to is these are decisions that should not be made by school counselors who are not trained in this field, because those early affirmations, forced affirmations, can clearly harm the child in the long run over time. And it's for that reason I hope that the members of this body will see this as a measure to protect children and support the engrossment and pass this on to the third reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Virginia Beach, Delegate Converse Fowler.
Mr. Speaker, speaking briefly on the bill.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to urge the body to vote no on engrossment. My oldest child has smiled more than I've ever seen in my child's life because at school they go by Theo and he loves it. And the amount of comfort my child has in what they wear and being who they are in their own skin is invaluable and worthwhile. And we don't understand this generation, and I'm an old millennial. I don't understand this generation as well, but I do know that when my child is happy, that the right thing is being done. And I appreciate Virginia Beach school system for always using proper pronouns and names for my children. And please vote no to this bill for the future of our children.
Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading. Yeah, okay. Ayes and nays are called for. Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? The clerk will close the roll. Sorry, Delegate. Sorry, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, Delegate Converse Fowler.
Nay.
Close the roll.
Ayes 50, noes 48.
Ayes 50, noes 48. The bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading.
House Bill